Have you ever had that experience where you're talking to someone who maybe just started in the industry or some other industry and you're providing mentorship to them, and then next thing you know, 5 years later, they come in and they're the CEO of a company? Today, I had the pleasure of speaking with Gary Acosta. He is the founder of the National Association of Hispanic Real Estate Professionals, and he has a great story about his basketball coach, who he said was really just a pain and, a tough coach, who ended up being one of the winningest coaches in basketball later on after Gary was done playing. We also talk about Latino homeownership and some of the trends that he's seeing right now based on their research, and how the NAR settlement may impact Latino homebuyers and what you should know about that so that you can help them get into homes, because the number of homeownerships in the Latino community is definitely rising, and it's important to know. So listen for the data as we talk about it and enjoy the podcast. Gary, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Tracey. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I really had a great time at your event in Washington, D.C. I really appreciate all of your hospitality. Really interesting stuff that we'll talk about some of that today. I also love your blog because I feel like you walk a fine line, and you do it very respectfully, and really, it's just done really, really well. So I just want to let you know that. And I want to talk to you a little bit about some of your recent blog posts, because you brought up one that I thought was really interesting about the NAR settlement and how it will impact Latino real estate agents. And why don't you just tell me a little bit about that? Like, what are the impacts? And tell me a little bit about Latino home buyers, I guess I should say, and how you feel like they will be impacted by the settlement.
Yeah, so Tracey, thank you for your comments about my blog. I try to be a little bit provocative. I do try to be respectful, but I get a lot of comments, some of them good, some of them not so good. So I think that's the whole point, right? Create engagement and get people to think a little bit. But I've been pretty consistent in my comments about the settlement and the lawsuits in general, and what I describe as unintended consequences to the marketplace, especially to first-time home buyers. And the data shows that a very high percentage, more than 50% of first-time home buyers over the next 20 years will come from the Latino community. So we feel that this issue really affects our members, really affects our mission in a very direct and maybe even a disproportionate way. So this is one of the reasons why we felt that it's been essential for us to be vocal on the issue and make sure people understand where we stand on it. So just to kind of cut to the meat of the issue itself, at the center of these class action lawsuits and of the settlement is the practice known as broker cooperation. And there are those that believe broker cooperation is a form of antitrust, and that the collusion that takes place between buyers and sellers agent amounts to a non-competitive environment. So I feel strongly that that's not really what's happening out there and what has happened historically. This is a practice that has basically been taking place for roughly 100 years. And with all of the sort of flaws and areas and opportunities for improvement in our industry, I think fundamentally the industry has actually functioned pretty well. We have, basically an environment where 2/3 of American households own their own home. People have access to credit. Our secondary mortgage market has been helpful in that regard. There are a lot of good things about the industry. So if you're going to dismantle something as central as broker cooperation, and really, change the way the business operates, we know that there's always going to be winners and there's always going to be losers when there's massive disruption in an industry. And if you look at who benefits from broker cooperation, it's generally the buyer, and especially first-time home buyers, because any first-time home buyer can choose essentially any agent they want to represent them through a very complex process. And they don't have to come out of pocket to compensate their agent. That agent is paid through seller proceeds. Now, some people feel like that's not fair. Why should the seller have to pay for the buyer's agent? Well, there's some benefits to that. First of all, In doing so, it exposes their listing to a higher percentage of would-be home buyers, which creates a more efficient market, which over time we believe has provided the seller with the highest execution in terms of price point that they can get for their home. But it also kind of equals out over time. So when that buyer, maybe in 5 or 10 years, decides that they want to sell that property and move up, then it's their turn to pay for those commissions. So it's not like there's one segment of our population that ends up carrying, all of the burden. I've said this in some of my talking points. If you put 100 first-time home buyers in a room and you explain to them how this process works, and you tell them that they're not going to have to pay for their agent out of pocket, but at some point it will be their turn to do so, I think 99% of them would say, we'll take that deal because we're going to get the relief when we need it the most. And that's when we're buying that very first home and we're struggling to scrape together the down payment. So in changing that, which, we think is at risk right now, where buyers would have to come out of pocket to pay for their own real estate agent representation, we're creating a much higher barrier to homeownership than we've had historically. And we see that happening at a time when I think the market can least afford that. Affordability has been, at an all-time low. There's many headwinds that home buyers have to face right now, especially if it's your first time in the market, especially if you come from a diverse community that doesn't have a whole lot of wealth, and maybe it doesn't even have anybody in their extended family who's gone through the process before. The burden and those barriers to homeownership are significant. And so this exacerbates that in a significant way. So just to kind of finish this, I probably have spent more time answering this question than maybe you anticipated. But I think that all of us in the industry have an obligation to always look for ways to improve process, to improve efficiency, to save buyers money. But the one thing we should all agree on first is let's not do harm to those first-time home buyers. Everything else should be on the table as long as we're not making things more difficult for first-time home buyers.
Yeah, I think it gets forgotten that buyers become sellers, become buyers, become sellers. But I definitely agree with you. I'm hoping that it doesn't become a burden on the buyer, that negotiations will continue to happen and sellers will continue to be open to paying the buyer's agents commission and compensation. So I guess that remains to be seen. I know there's a lot of confusion around it right now, and NAR is working on hammering out some of the details. So
yeah, I think that the market sort of finds a way to adjust. So the one thing that we're concerned about is whether or not the federal government is going to intercede and make broker cooperation essentially illegal. And if they do that, then I think they're going to take a bad situation and make it much worse.
yeah, absolutely. What I loved about your post was that you talked about all of the resiliency of the Latino home buyer and Latino community and how they will adjust to this. So do you want to talk a little bit about that? And I know you said kind of they've repeatedly overcome tough setbacks. They do have rising income and education. So you want to talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So it's kind of interesting, and I just had a board meeting yesterday with the NAHREP National Board, and I was explaining to them that there's two sort of parallel messages that are going to come from us moving forward. One is painting a very dark picture of what could happen if we make bad decisions about these policies moving forward. But the other is going to be a very positive perspective on how I think the market is going to react, how the Latino market is going to become even more important to the overall health and well-being of the industry overall over time. And my blog touched on a lot of those things. So I'm a big believer in, there's certain macroeconomic trends that are undeniable. And demographics is definitely one of them. A couple of years ago, the Urban Institute put out a study that suggested that up to 70% of new home buyers over the next 20 years will come from the Hispanic community. And the primary reasons for that are the youth of the Hispanic population. So Hispanics in the United States are roughly 15 years younger on average than the non-Hispanic white population. So they're just kind of entering into those prime home buying years. And then there are other intangible sort of factors, such as just the propensity and the desire that Latinos tend to have for home ownership. Latinos are a very family-centric community. The home is the center of the family experience. So data and surveys have shown year after year that Hispanics tend to out-index the general population in terms of their desire for home ownership. I joke sometimes when I talk about Hispanic immigrants. Believe it or not, they don't come to this country because of our food or our music or our cultural elements. They like that, but that's not why they're here. They come to this country for economic opportunity, and at the center of that is owning their own home, which really is the cornerstone to the American dream. So yes, those factors are probably the biggest one. And there are others as well that really give us a lot of confidence in knowing that Hispanics will continue to be a very large source of growth in our industry moving forward.
Yeah, and you had a great post as well on the buyer's agent, and kind of flipped the narrative on its head, because not people in the industry, but consumers and outside the industry have this idea that, well, I find my house on Zillow, so I'm calling an agent. All they're doing is showing me a house. They're not doing anything else. Why should I pay them? And so talk to me a little bit about that, because you also reminded everyone that most of these real estate trainers really train people to be listing agents. Like, you want to be a listing agent, it's easier. And right now, people don't think that.
So I think the heading of that blog was "Buyer's Agents Do God's Work."
Yes.
and I truly believe that, because I think some people may not remember or may not totally understand the important role that buyer's agents play in the process, and the fact that many of them are doing so at somewhat of a sacrifice. Like I said in my blog, most trainers, most pundits in the industry that are coaching agents to be more efficient and how to make more money guide them almost in a uniform fashion towards being seller's agents. Buyer's agents are, I don't want to be, put words in anybody's mouth, but it's a waste of time. That the ROI that you get in investing in buyers is a fraction of what you get if you invest the same effort in sellers. And it kind of makes sense, because you're representing a seller. The odds are that that transaction is going to close at some point and you're going to get paid for that work. Whereas if you're representing buyers, that's not necessarily the case, especially in the last several years. I've talked to many, many agents who've said that they probably have to represent 4 or 5 buyers for every one transaction that they end up closing, just because it's been so competitive out there. So these are agents that have to spend time coaching customers, sort of guiding them through the mortgage process, showing them and coaching them how to make sure to properly document their income and their reserves, helping them understand some of the more intimidating factors of going through that process, warning them on all of the pitfalls, showing them how to read an inspection report. Every local municipality have different rules. I've said this many times. I consider myself a fairly savvy person when it comes to the real estate process. I myself would not purchase a home without a real estate agent because of all those things. So I could only imagine how difficult and intimidating that process might be for someone who's never gone through the process before. So yes, I truly believe that buyer's agents do God's work.
Yeah, and I mean, not to mention that most agents are trained as buyer's agents first. It's an easy way to start, making money or learning the business really well as well. So, yeah. Now you do a lot of research, or NAHREP does a lot of research, and you recently released your homeownership, Latino homeownership report. So I want to talk about some of the top takeaways from that you can share with the audience.
Yeah, so every year we produce a report called the State of Hispanic Homeownership Report. And we break the report down to a handful of buckets. The first one is we take a look back and we look at the previous year and see how Hispanics fared from a homeownership standpoint. And we look a little bit deeper than we have historically, try to look at it from a regional perspective, not just a national perspective, and try to identify what some of those trends were. Last year's report showed that the Hispanic homeownership rate increased for the 8th consecutive year, which is the only ethnic demographic to have 8 straight years of homeownership gains in that regard, which is actually really quite remarkable because homeownership rates are a ratio of households versus owner households. And that denominator for Hispanics, which is the overall number of households, has also been increasing at a faster pace than the overall population. So to see that percentage continuing to increase every year really says a lot about the resiliency and the focus and passion that Hispanics have on home ownership. So that was very encouraging because we didn't necessarily expect that to be the case for last year. As we know, affordability was extremely difficult. Inventory was very hard to come by. And it was really a challenge that we saw happening in almost every market throughout the United States. Another trend that we saw that really was an indicator as to why those numbers keep increasing is the mobility of the Latino community. It seems like Hispanics are more willing to move to where there are jobs and affordable housing. So if you look at the spikes in homeownership from a geographic standpoint, you'll see that the Hispanic homeownership numbers increase in the Midwest, in the South, in more affordable markets, and what I describe as non-traditional Hispanic markets. So the growth wasn't necessarily happening in Los Angeles and in South Florida, or even in New York. It was happening in Nashville, Tennessee, and Des Moines, Iowa, and Louisville, Kentucky, and markets like that, where you've seen a migration of Latinos moving into those markets because there's job opportunities there, but also because there's affordable housing. So those are some of the highlights of the report itself. The report also looks at what kind of we can expect from a homeownership standpoint. So we do look at household formations, we look at income trends, and we look at surveys on consumer sentiment. Are Latinos just as enthusiastic about homeownership as they have been historically? All of those data points indicate that we can expect continued growth in the Hispanic sector for a number of years. So that's very positive. And the last piece of the report addresses policy issues. So ways that the industry and elected officials can ensure that Latino homeownership will continue moving forward. So we'll look at things such as access to credit, some of the policies associated with that. We know that Latinos are twice as likely as the overall population to be self-employed. So that issue is especially important to Latino buyers. We also look at things such as immigration reform and understanding that Latinos also play a huge role in the supply side. They are a high percentage of the workforce of the construction industry, and labor costs and access to labor in that sector has been very difficult. So we think smart immigration reform where people can come to this country legally and be able to supplement our workforce is also a factor in seeing these homeownership trends continue.
Sometimes I feel like that immigration reform is never going to happen, though. I feel like it's both sides, executive order, executive order.
It's become a political football, as they call it, and both sides try to leverage it for their own political gain. And unfortunately, it affects our economy. So most people have seen immigration as a social policy, when in fact we think it's actually more of an economic policy. And I think if you look at it from that lens, you can be a little bit more pragmatic about putting policies in there that make sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, hopefully someday soon. So, so I want to talk about some of the priorities that you have right now at NAHREP from a policy standpoint. What are some of the initiatives you're working on?
So, I look at policy from kind of 3 different buckets. So number one is housing affordability. So what policies can help improve that? We think housing affordability is a factor of housing supply. So, and if you look at housing supply and you talk to builders and you talk to people who are in that business, zoning, and just the cost of bureaucracy as it pertains to building new housing are definitely areas where there is an opportunity to improve the environment. So that's probably the number one area that we focus in from a policy standpoint. Second is access to credit. And so we want to make sure that Latino first-time homebuyers in particular continue to have access to affordable mortgage products. We see nuances in the population, such as self-employed and a tendency to participate in the gig economy. I joke that I think we didn't have a term for it 20 years ago, but Latinos sort of invented the gig economy. So we've always had side hustles. We've always had little, side businesses. But it's been more, those are that is income that is more difficult to document and predict. But I think new technologies, even AI, give us a lot of promise, provide a lot of promise on how we may be able to solve and better predict capacity for borrowers moving forward. Debt to income ratios, I was doing that when I got into the business 35 years ago. There has to be a better way to predict capacity, especially as the economy has changed. So advocating for innovations in that regard is also critical. And then the whole issue of diversity in the industry, which we think is, again, not only something that has to do with what's fair, what's right, but also what is smart. This is still a very complex transaction that people, if they're lucky, may do a couple times in their lifetime. So having a professional who can help them navigate through the process, who understands their culture, maybe can speak their language, is an invaluable resource to have if we want to see homeownership numbers continue to move forward within the Hispanic sector and other sectors moving forward.
Absolutely. All really important priorities for sure. So what excites you the most about the real estate industry moving forward?
Well, I keep reminding people that anytime there's change, there's opportunity. We are sort of creatures of habit. So we're uncomfortable with change, and especially significant change. We like things to be predictable. But those of us that are more entrepreneurial see that there are always opportunities when there is change. And there's definitely a lot of change happening in the industry, not just from a policy standpoint and with the lawsuits and the way compensation is going to be addressed moving forward, but also with technology and AI and the innovations that are going to come from there. I think that's all very exciting. I see technology as a way to actually close homeownership and wealth gaps moving forward if we're smart and we're proactive about that. And then in terms of the industry itself, it is basic math. And that is every year we add roughly 1 million new households to the United States. Those people need a place to live. So I think the demand for homeownership and demand for housing is only going to increase in the coming years. And so those of us that are in the industry and well situated and understand some of those trends, I think are going to do very well in the coming years.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been through many changes in through the industry since I've started in real estate reporting many years ago, early 90s. And, I remember one of them being kind of the advent of Zillow or property information online. It was going to ruin real estate agents, and it didn't. And so I'm hoping that people listening will take advantage of the opportunities that the NAR settlement provides rather than focusing on, everything that's being taken away or the negatives of it, because I think there's always good with transparency. And, changing business practices can be difficult, but it's not impossible either.
I
So,
agree with that completely.
yeah. So you've been in leadership for a long time. So I want to know your most impactful leadership lesson that you learned over the years.
Well, that's I appreciate the question. That's a great question. I have been in leadership for a long time, but I was a very young man when I started NAHREP 24 years ago. So I'm still in the game. But I do study leadership, even anecdotally, quite a bit, because it is a differentiator. So I do believe that at the end of the day, people look for leaders that have strong emotional intelligence. So people who are cool when there is challenges around them. I've always said that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And I think good leaders have the ability to kind of rise above the fray and see things in their proper perspective and can articulate. And I think that's one thing that people may underestimate the value of leadership is communication skills and the ability to be able to articulate your vision in a way that connects with people. You have to go where people are, and you have to communicate in a way that connects with people and, hopefully inspires them as well. So yes, I think that emotional intelligence and having those keen communication skills to be able to articulate your vision well, to me, those are the best leaders.
How do you learn something like that? Like, how do you learn how to articulate your vision so that it resonates with the people that you're leading?
I think some people have an aptitude towards that, but you can definitely improve those skills if you want to. And then, so I think the best way to do that is to look at leaders that inspire you, whether it's a Steve Jobs or a Barack Obama, and really examine the cadence that they speak in, the words that they choose, the way that they're able to, frame an issue and take a complex issue and pare it down to something that is much easier to understand. To me, those are the best communicators. So studying them, watching them speak, reading books, because there is data. There are, books written about the subject. And then, the whole issue of emotional intelligence, there's a lot of research on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So now it's time to get vulnerable. What was your greatest aha moment? Maybe it was in personal life or maybe it was in your professional life, but it really caused you to pause and kind of rethink something you were doing or change a practice or.
So so I'll give you a couple things. So first of all, I was a mortgage banker. I learned the business. I worked at a community bank. I ended up starting my own mortgage brokerage at 26 years old. About 10 years after that, I co-founded NAHREP. And when the housing crisis took place in 2008, it was a very scary time for all of us in the industry. And it required me to basically put everything that I was doing on a table and put, basically everything was on the table, so to speak, as I was trying to make a decision of what I wanted to do with my career moving forward. It's very difficult for people to pivot away from something that they know well and that has been there for them. And I'm talking about particular career paths that they've been on, and to say, I'm going to go in a completely different direction. That's a difficult thing for a lot of people to do. And a lot of people talk about resilience as being such an important quality in terms of success. And it absolutely is. But certain people know when it's time to pivot. So being resilient and being able to overcome adversity is probably the most important skill that any entrepreneur or any business person can have. But also having the ability to know when to pivot is a tough one. So when I had to pivot back in 2008, to me, that was the bravest thing I ever did from a career standpoint. That was an aha moment. The other one was, be nice to the person sitting next to you because you definitely do not know where they will be in 5 years. I got a chance to be the commencement speaker at the UC Irvine School of Business a year and a half ago. And I talked about the fact that I played small college basketball, Division III basketball. And I had a very tough coach when I played basketball. Turns out that coach was Greg Popovich, who is the winningest coach in the history of the NBA. And to me, he was just a difficult, pain in the ass guy that I had to play for, that tried to keep me from doing what I wanted to do on the basketball court. But to me, that gave me the best lesson of all. And that is, you don't know, who is sitting next to you, where they're going to be in a few years. So take care of those relationships because those relationships are going to be your currency at some point in the future.
That is absolutely true. Definitely. My final question is just where do you see the most opportunity in the market in the coming year?
The real estate market?
Yes.
In general? Yeah, I do think that the utility for properties is going to be looked at differently. I do think that the phenomena of working from home is not something that's going to go away. Maybe it'll evolve and there'll be different iterations of it, but it's not going to go away. I think those factors are going to play into how real estate is developed in the coming years, and where and how density, all those things are going to be affected by it. So I do think that that's going to be a very interesting evolution to see happen. And I think there's going to be great opportunities in the industry from that. I also think that, technology, which may be an overused kind of, fallback issue and an issue to point to, whatever we've seen happen from a technology standpoint over the last 20 years is going to happen over the next 2 years, essentially. And that is going to also create all sorts of opportunities. People who know how to use technology well, I think are going to rise to the top.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, things change so quickly, and it is really interesting, especially with all the generative AI and the opportunities out there for that too. So,
For sure.
well, Gary, thank you so much for joining the Real Trending podcast. We appreciate all of your insights and you taking the time to speak to us.
You guys are awesome. So thank you very much, Tracey. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Gary.